奉主耶稣圣名，继续来查考圣经的道理。
In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, we continue to study the words in the Bible.
今天下午要用从关心神的家而蒙福来跟大家一起查考。
This afternoon, I would like to use the topic, Be blessed through caring for the matters in the household of God, as a mutual study topic.
我们读圣经会看到许多人物他们真的很爱神。
From reading the Bible, we will see many characters who really truly love God.
那神也真的照他所说的话大大的祝福这些爱他的人。
And according to God's words, He also indeed greatly blessed these people.
所以我们有智慧的人，就是从圣经的教训里面去得到生活的应用。
So those who have wisdom will be able to gain from the wisdom from reading the Bible and apply it in their lives.
因为圣经不能够只停留是有一些知识的层面而已。
Because when we are reading the Bible, we cannot only stop at understanding in the level of knowledge.
因为有时候我们知识很多，但是如果我们没有相对的把它行出来呢，这个时候其实会有产生很多的副作用。
Because the more knowledge that we have from the Bible, if on the contrary we're unable to put them into practice in our own lives, there will actually be a lot of negative consequences.
那所以我们今天每天读圣经，我们就是每天看到神对我们的提醒，让我们在生活里面越来越敬畏神，也能够来应用神告诉我们的道理来蒙福。
So every day when we're reading the Bible, we're trying to learn from the words in the Bible and to learn to be more and more in our God-fearing lives.
我们今天下午呢，来从大卫他爱神的表现，然后神给他的祝福来学习怎么样在我们的生活当中真的来更爱主耶稣基督。
This afternoon, we will use the topic of how David loved the Lord and how the Lord greatly blessed him as a lesson that we can all learn and apply in our lives.
请看撒母耳记下第7章。
Let's read 2 Samuel chapter 7.
撒母耳记下第7章。
2 Samuel chapter 7.
这一章在记录大卫当王以后。他在一个平安的环境的时候，他想到了神。
This chapter records that in a time of peace, David remembered God.
第一节是说，他住在自己的宫里面，神使他安静，不被视为的仇敌扰乱了。
Verse 1 says that, Now it came to pass, when the king was dwelling in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies all around.
表面上看起来是大卫率领他的精兵到处征战，到处得胜，所以视为的列邦呢都臣服于他，他得到安静。
On the surface, it looked as if David was the one that led all his soldiers and his army who conquered everywhere, and that he was able to gain peace through this way.
但其实是神似乎他让他安静的。
But in actuality, it was God who had given him rest and peace.
如果不是神带领他，让这个视为的仇敌会惧怕，然后让他的军队可以得胜，大卫也不可能有今天这样的一个场面。
If it wasn't the Lord who was able to make all his enemies around him be afraid of him, and that God was the one that subdued all the armies, he would not be able to enjoy his rest.
特别是当列邦的这些国家呢，他们主动的来送礼物给大卫的时候，他更清楚这些恩典都从神来的。
And especially when the other nations actively brought gifts to David, he understood that all these grace came from God.
所以在撒母耳记下第5章呢，当大卫他被高作以色列王以后，
in chapter 5 of the book of 2 Samuel, after David was anointed king,
也就是说是统领整个以色列各族了不是只有犹大家而已。
basically he was able to reign over the whole kingdom of Israel and not just the house of Judah.
好，所以在第5章的第11节呢，我们就看到了这个推罗王西兰就主动的送了很多材料给大卫，要让他建宫殿。
And we see in verse 11 of chapter 5 that Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and he actively brought presents to David.
所以这个推罗王因为他看起来是第一个承认大卫是当全以色列王的这个外国的元首，而且还送一大堆的礼物跟这个匠人呢来协助大卫。
And so from the looks of it, the king of Tyre was the first one from the other nations that acknowledged David as the king of the whole kingdom of Israel. And he brought carpenters, masons, and also gifts to David.
到第12节呢，这个时候圣经就说大卫知道是神坚立他做以色列的王了。
And then in verse 12, it says that David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel.
而且又为自己的民以色列使他的国兴旺。
And that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel.
所以大卫打从心里知道这是神的恩典，神托付给他一个很重要的任务，就是要管理他的百姓。
So David knew from the bottom of his heart that it was God who had given him this grace, and it was a mission that was entrusted to him to manage the people of God.
我们都知道大卫他是一个合神心意的王。
We all know that David was a king that was after the heart of God.
所以大卫他基本上在对外征战的时候，他都会先求问神。
And so basically David would always inquire of God before a battle.
但是毕竟大卫还是人，
But after all, David was a
他
man.
有时候也会用人的方式来做事。
And so sometimes he would also use the ways of man to do things.
所以我们从第5章你会看到说，他打仗的时候跟非利士人打仗，大卫都求问神。
And so from chapter 5, we could see that when he was fighting with the Philistines, he inquired of the Lord.
因为那神就指示他要怎么打胜。
And then God instructed him on how to have victory.
那大卫他一遵行神的命令，到处就得胜了。
And so when David followed God's command, he was able to have victory.
但是到第6章的时候，
But until chapter 6,
那时候大卫他就想到说要把约柜呢从这个当时候是在示罗这个帐幕约柜要把它搬到耶路撒冷来。
So in chapter 6, David remembered that he wanted to bring the Ark of God. At that time, it was in Shiloh, and he wanted to bring it to Jerusalem.
因为那其实当时候大卫当王之前的扫罗做王的时候，都没有想到神约柜的事情。
And before David, when King Saul was the king, he never thought about the Ark of the Covenant of God.
其实那个时候的神约柜是在一个人的家里已经待了20年了。
At that time, the Ark of God was in someone's house for more than 20 years.
所以大卫他当时候为了要搬移这个约柜呢，他第6章的第1节说，他召集了以色列中所有挑选的3万人。
And so at that time, in order to bring the Ark of God to him, David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000 in verse 1 of chapter 6.
在历代志上的第13章记载同样的事情。
In 1 Chronicles chapter 13, it recorded the same incident.
那在历代志上呢，特别描述大卫是问了很多千夫长、百夫长跟这个民中的首领，说要怎么样来运约柜到耶路撒冷来，问他们这个意见。
And in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, it also recorded that in order to do this thing, David actually consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds and with every leader.
那时候大家都说好，应该是要把约柜运到耶路撒冷城来。
And so at that time, everyone agreed and said it was a good thing to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem.
我们就看到大卫号召了这么多人，这么浩大的场面要来迎接约柜。
And so we were able to see that David gathered so many people and made it into such an important event to bring the Ark.
这个地方我们就没看到大卫他去问神。
But at this event, we do not see that David inquired of God.
他如果问神这件事情要怎么做，神的指示一定是不一样的。
If he asked God how should he go about doing this thing, then God's instruction would be different.
所以后来我们就看到大卫他按照非利士人的方法去做了一辆新的车子，用牛拉着要把约柜运到耶路撒冷城。
And so later on we could see that David used the way of the Philistines. He brought a new cart and he put the Ark of God on top of it to bring it to Jerusalem.
我们知道运约柜这件事情 让乌撒被神当场击杀。
And we also know that because of this incident, Uzzah was put to death by God on the spot.
所以我们看到大卫基本上犯了2个错误，
And so we see that David basically made 2 mistakes.
就是他没有求问神的意见，他只是去问了人，认为这样好不好。
He did not ask what God's instruction was. He only asked man whether this is a good thing.
第2件的错误就是他没有去从律法去看约柜应该要怎么搬运，而是效法了外邦人的方式，把约柜放在新车上。
And the second mistake that he made was that he did not look into the law of God to see how he needed to transport the ark, but he followed the way of the Gentiles.
那最后就发生了乌撒他伸手要去扶约柜的时候被神击杀。
And so in the end, it happened that Uzzah, when he put out his hand to the ark of God, he was killed by God.
那是因为当时候这些人藐视了神的圣洁。
And it was because at that time these people despised the holiness of God.
他们特别是对大卫自己本身来说，他忽视了神的命令。
And especially for David, personally, he ignored or he overlooked the command of God.
因为当时候大卫似乎是认为说，把约柜运到耶路撒冷城来，对他的国家的安定是有帮助的。
Because at that time, it seemed as if David wanted to bring the ark to Jerusalem to help with the prosperity and peace of his kingdom.
因为他要让耶路撒冷城真的成为政治宗教的中心，让所有人都能够集中在这个约柜面前来求问神得到建立。
Because he wanted to make Jerusalem the center of his political and religious power, so that all people would be able to go into the city of Jerusalem to inquire of God, and he can have peace and prosperity.
可是，在这件事情上，他就没有尊重神的要求，特别是有关神的圣洁的方面。
But in this thing, he did not put an emphasis on asking what God's requirement is, especially in terms of his holiness.
所以当时候大卫看到乌撒死了之后，他心里就愁烦，他就很害怕了。
And so at that time, when David saw that Uzzah died, he was very discouraged and very troubled.
6章的第9节就说，大卫就说：“神的约柜怎么可以运到我这里来呢？”
In verse 9, David was afraid, and then he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?"
不是说大卫他不爱神，
It's not to say that David did not love the Lord.
而是发生了这件事情之后，大卫不知道说，在他的这些安排里面有哪一些是神不喜悦的事情。
But it is to say that in his whole arrangement, David did not know which one was the one that God was not pleased with.
因为神的处置非常的严厉，因为乌撒只是出于好心要去扶住约柜，就被当场击杀。
Because God's doing was very harsh. Uzzah, out of the kindness of his heart, wanted to hold on to the ark, but then God killed him.
从我们人间的角度来看，会觉得说，那这样神未免太严厉了吧？
From the perspective of man, we may feel that God is too harsh.
但是我们就看到，其实神在意他的圣洁是多么样的严谨，就是没有人可以侵犯他所说过的话。
But then, on the other hand, we're able to see that how much emphasis God places on His holiness. No one can break His commandments.
所以我们看到说，不尊敬神的罪很重的。
And so we can see that to disrespect God, this sin is quite serious.
所以当时候大卫就害怕，他不敢。在除非他搞清楚以前，他不敢把约柜直接运到耶路撒冷去了。
And so we could see that David became afraid, and before he found out exactly what happened, he was afraid to bring the ark to Jerusalem.
所以最后这个约柜是被运到加特人俄北以东的家里去了。
And so in the end, the ark was put in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite.
那这个俄北以东呢，如果我们看历代志上的时候，就发现他其实是一个利未，应该是利未人。
From reading First Chronicles, we could see that this person, Obed-Edom, he was actually a Levite.
那因为他是在神的殿里面当守门的。
Because he was a housekeeper in the house of God.
所以在历代志上15章，应该是15章，我们会看到很多有关俄北以东这个人他的工作被记录下来。
And so in the book of First Chronicles, chapter 15, it should be in chapter 15 that we see a lot of the events that was recorded by this person,
俄北以东
Obed-Edom.
这个家庭，他让约柜住进来。
And Obed-Edom, this person, his household allowed the ark of God to come in.
第6章的11节特别说， 在这3个月期间，神赐福给俄贝以东和他的全家。
In chapter 6 of verse 11, it is specially recorded that during this period of time, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household.
当大卫他不敢接纳约柜的时候，俄贝以东打开他家门，让约柜进来。
When everyone was afraid to bring the ark, Obed-Edom opened up his household to bring the ark of God in.
你看那个时候神是怎么样祝福这个家庭的？
And then we could see at that time how much God blessed this family.
不是只有这个人，而且包括他的全家。
Not just this person, but his whole family.
他这个家庭得到了福气，甚至让王都觉得哇，那个神这么大的恩典，怎么可以把它放在俄贝以东的家里呢？
And the blessing that he received was so great, it would even made the king feel that how could such great blessings be remained only at his household.
表示说，俄贝以东他家的蒙福是众人都知道，很明显的，所以这个消息传到大卫那边去了。
And so it tells us that the blessing that Obed-Edom's family received was so great that everybody could see, and it was how the news went to David.
6章的第12节接下去说，大卫他就去他说就去了，欢欢喜喜的要把神的约柜从俄贝以东的家里抬到大卫的城里来。
And then in verse 12 it said that so David went and he brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness.
那其实在历代志上的相关的经文看来呢，特别是在第15章，应该是大卫他后来去问了祭司应该要怎么搬运约柜的这个做法以后，他知道怎么做，就去把约柜搬回来。
And from the recording of 1 Chronicles chapter 15, we could see that later on David asked the priests of how he should bring the ark of God into Jerusalem, and they told him how.
所以大卫从他的错误里面得到教训，他知道要怎么做了。
And so David learned from his mistake, and he knew what to do.
他现在决定要按照神的方式来行。
And so he decided that he wanted to do things according to God's way.
所以他这是派了祭司到俄贝以东的家里要抬约柜。
And so he sent priests to the household of Obed-Edom to carry the ark of the covenant.
其实我们可以具体的，我们可以查地图他这个从俄贝以东的家到约柜到耶路撒冷这个路程有多远呢？
And from the map, we could study to see exactly what the distance is between the house of Obed-Edom to the city of Jerusalem.
这些抬约柜的祭司，他们要走很远的路的。
These priests who had to carry the Ark of the Covenant, they had to walk a very long
但是
distance.
不管多远，这就是神的要求。
But no matter how long the distance is, it was the requirement of God.
这就是神规定的要搬约柜的方法。
And this was the way that God required of how to carry the
要
ark.
放在祭司的肩头上，
It had to be carried on the shoulders of the
要这
priests.
4个在抬的人都能够同心合意的这样一直往前行。
And the 4 people that were carrying the ark had to do it in one accord and go forward.
要很小心的，不能够让约柜掉下去。
And they had to be very careful so that the ark would not fall
他们
off.
都不能跌倒的。
And they could not stumble.
路途很远，很难行，但是他们要完成任务，把它抬回到大卫所指定的地方来。
The journey is very long and very difficult, but they needed to carry the ark according to David's instruction.
在第6章，我们看到第13节，当抬约柜的人走了6步以后，大卫就开始献祭。
We could see from verse 13 of chapter 6 in 2 Samuel that after those who were bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, David started to sacrifice.
他们才刚刚起步而已就要献祭，为什么？
Why is it that they've just started walking and then he had to make a sacrifice?
因为大卫他要确定他所做的是合神心意、神喜悦的。
Because David wanted to make sure that whatever he was doing was in accordance with God's will.
他也表明这个动作表明他愿意亲近神的心，要愿意照神的旨意来行。
And this action also showed his heart of wanting to be close to God and to want to follow God's will.
这个时候，大卫不是穿着他很荣耀的王的服装
And at this time, David did not wear his glorious robe as a king.
他把王的服 脱掉，穿上了以弗得。
He took off his kingly robe and he wore a linen ephod.
他穿的细麻布的以弗得，表示他要在神面前成为仆人。
He wore a linen ephod in front of God to show that he wanted to be a servant in front of
他
God.
现在把约柜迎到大卫城去，不是要来展现他的王位有多荣耀，
And to bring the ark of God to Jerusalem, his point was not to show how glorious his kingdom
而
was,
是他的决心，他要成为神的仆人。
but rather it was his determination to show God that he wanted to be a servant.
他要成为神的仆人，是欢喜快乐的，在人面前极力的踊跃跳舞。
And he wanted to be a servant of God with joy and gladness, and he danced with all his might in front of everyone.
他借着这个动作，更加的在神面前能够谦卑。
And through this action, he even more humbled himself in front of God.
因为他知道能够成为神谦卑的仆人是个福气，也是蒙福的开始。
Because he knew that to become a humble servant of God was a blessing, and it is also the beginning of all blessings.
虽然后来你看他的妻子米甲大大的轻视他，
Even though later on his wife, Michal, despised him,
但是大卫他不为所动。
but then David was not moved.
他不是为了要取悦他的妻子，所以他就放弃了敬拜神的，在神面前卑微的这样的一个做法。
David did not give up this humble action in front of God just to please his wife.
所以他跟他的妻子宣告他要做的事。
And so David proclaimed it to his wife of the thing that he wanted to do.
第22节说：“我必更加的卑微，自己看为轻贱。”
In verse 22, he said, I will be even more undignified than this and will be humble in my own sight.
那真的，后来大卫就得到神更大的祝福。
And later on, indeed, David was blessed by God greatly.
他尊敬神，就得到神的尊敬。
He respected God, and God respected him in return.
所以神就接着大大祝福他。
And then later on, God blessed him greatly.
我们就看到大卫从他当王之后，他整个心意都是一直在想到有关于神的事。
We could see that after David became king, all his thoughts were relating to God.
那所以接下去第7章呢，我们就看到，当他都已经国家都平静以后，他现在想到神的约柜是在帐幕里。
And then later on in chapter 7, we could see that after he had received rest in his kingdom, he then thought about how the ark of God was in a tent.
他当时候跟拿单先知这样说。
At that time, he said to prophet Nathan.
7章的第2节，看我住在香柏木的宫中，但神的约柜反在幔子里。
In chapter 7, verse 2, he said, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains.
神并没有要求先知去跟大卫讲任何有关于约柜的事情，
God did not ask the prophet to tell David anything regarding the ark.
是大卫他本身主动的想到神约柜的事。
But David himself proactively thought about the matter
他
of the
想到
ark
他
of
自己
God.
所住的环境，
He thought about where he was living
他所得到的敬重。
and all the respect that he received.
那他想到的是约柜在这个幔子里，
And then he thought about how the ark was in a
他
tent.
从心里面觉得这样子好像不应该，
And from the bottom of his heart, he felt like it shouldn't be so.
所以很自然的，大卫想到为神做一些事情。
And then so very naturally, David thought about wanting to do something for the Lord.
是因为大卫他跟神的关系真的已经很亲密了。
And this was because David had a very close relationship with God.
从他幼年开始，一直到现在这个时候，大卫都知道是神让他一步一步的能够走到今天当王的这个地步来。
Ever since a young age, David realized that it was God who led him step by step in order for him to become king.
所以他想要为神做事，
So he wanted to do things for God.
所以基本上就是他想要为神的约柜盖一个圣殿。
And so basically, he wanted to build a temple for the ark of God.
所以当时候他跟先知讲完之后，第3节拿单就对王说：“你可以照你的心意而行，因为神与你同在。”
And so after he told prophet Nathan, Nathan said to him, Do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you.
所以这件事情，你看拿单先知他都没有问神，他就直接觉得应该可以，所以他就说：“你可以照你的心意而行，没问题的。”
And so in regards to this thing, prophet Nathan didn't even ask God, and he felt like it should be okay. And so he said, Do all that is in your heart.
因为他基于他自己的想法，对他对神的认识，他觉得没有理由神会拒绝。
And it is because of Nathan's own thinking and also based on his understanding of God that he thought that there was no reason that God would refuse.
但是神后来讲的理由是真的是连拿单都没有想过的。
But later on, the reason that God brought up, it was something that even Prophet Nathan did not think of.
所以第4节当天晚上，神马上将他的话临到拿单了。
And that's why immediately in verse 4, on that same night, the word of God came to Nathan.
基本上，神要拿单说，神事实上是不愿意由大卫来建圣殿。
And basically, God wanted Nathan to tell David that God did not want David to build the temple.
所以大卫要为神建殿的心意，神领了，神拒绝说不要，我不要你做圣殿。
So the desire of David wanting to build a temple for God, God had received his intention, but he did not want David to build the temple.
我们想，当时候的拿单先知一定非常震惊啊。
We could think that at that time, Prophet Nathan must be shocked to hear this.
因为他当初想到是应该没问题，哪里知道说神的想法跟他不一样。
Because at that time, he thought it should be all right, but he did not realize that God's thoughts were not his.
这一件事情其实让我们想到的是，神的意念真的高过人的意念的。
And so this event taught us that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts.
因为我们人总是认为说，神，我如果觉得这样好，应该是神 OK 才对啊。
Because as men, we always believe that if something that we think is right and good, God should feel the same.
以赛亚书的55章啊。
In the book of Isaiah, chapter 55.
第55章的第8节。
Isaiah 55, verse 8.
这里特别说，神说：“我的意念非同你们的意念，我的道路非同你们的道路。”
God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways," says the Lord.
第9节说：“我的意念总是高过你们的意念的，我的道路高过你们的道路。”
And in verse 9, God's thoughts are always higher than our thoughts, and His ways are always higher than our
所以
ways.
我们有时候真的要详细的去求问去查验神的旨意，要借着求问神，才能够真的明白神要我们做什么。
And so many times we really need to look carefully into God's will and to study what God wants us to do.
我们要爱神，也要按照神的方法。
We need to love the Lord, but we also need to love the Lord with God's
我
ways.
相信大卫他对拿单所讲的话，他的心意也很经常的会发生在我们弟兄姐妹当中的。
I believe the words that David spoke to Prophet Nathan, his intention often happened in our brothers and sisters'
今天其实我
lives.
们很多弟兄姐妹是很爱神的，
Today, we have many brothers and sisters who truly love God.
但是有时候我们是用我们自己的方式想要来为神做什么事。
But many times we use our own ways to want to do some things for God.
那如果我们知道某些弟兄姐妹他们想要这样做的时候，按我们人的想法也会觉得说，那很好啊，应该没问题才对啊。
And many times when we find out what brothers and sisters wanted to do for God, according to our own thoughts, we all feel that it is a good thing and right thing to do.
但是其实神的意思不是这样子。
But in actuality, God's will may not be so.
所以当天晚上，神跟拿单说了他为什么不要大卫建殿的理由。
And so on that same night, God told Prophet Nathan his reason as to why he did not want David to build him a temple.
7章的第5节，
In verse 5 in chapter 7,
神的第一个理由是说，我没有住过殿里，从我领以色列人出埃及到现在，我没有住过一个家了哈，一个 house。
God's first reason was that ever since the time from Egypt, God never lived in a house.
我总是在会幕跟帐幕当中行走的，
He had always been in a tent and in a tabernacle
也就
moving
是
about.
都是跟着这些他的百姓在一起的，
God was always among his people.
他不是固定在一个地方。
He was not stationary somewhere.
第二个理由在第7节说，
And the second reason was in verse 7.
他说我同以色列人所走的地方，我何曾向以色列一支派的士师，就是我吩咐牧养我民的以色列说，你们为何不给我建造香柏木的殿宇呢？
Wherever I have moved about with all the children of Israel, have I ever spoken a word to anyone from the tribes of Israel whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar?
也就是说，神 不曾主动的去跟人家说，你应该为我建一个殿宇来让我居住。
Which was to say, God never actively or proactively asked people to build him a temple.
天地万物的主宰，充满宇宙万物的真神，他怎么会需要去住在一个所谓的殿宇里面呢？
Because the God, the sovereign Lord of the heavens and the earth, who is filled in this universe, why would he ever need to live in a temple?
那在历代志上的第22章的第8节呢，就大卫后来他自己讲的另外一个理由是神跟他讲的。
And in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 8, David himself spoke of another reason, which was something that God told him.
那就是因为他在这一段逃亡征战的过程当中，杀人流血太多。
It was the reason that during the time of his exile and journey, he had shed too much blood.
所以他所建造殿宇要让这个和平的神来居住是不适合的。
And the temple that he wanted to build for this God of peace was not appropriate.
所以神拒绝了大卫的请求。
And so God refused David's
那
request.
当时候，你看拿单一定很惊讶，神竟然这么一个大的爱心要为他做的事，神竟然不要。
And at that time, Prophet Nathan must be shocked to hear that such a great loving intention that David had was refused by God.
但是大卫他的心，神领受了。
But God accepted David's heart.
所以7章的第9节第8节，神要拿单转达。
And so in verse 9, God wanted Nathan to tell David.
神再一次的跟大卫应许。
And once again, God made a covenant with David.
第9节说：“你无论往哪里去，我都要常与你同在。”
In verse 9, I have been with you wherever you have gone.
要剪除你一切的仇敌，我必使你得大名，好像世上大有名的人一样。
And I will cut off all your enemies from before you, and I'll make you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth.
我们跳过去看第11节。
Let's skip to verse 11.
我要让你安静，不被一切的仇敌扰乱，
I will cause you to have rest from all your enemies,
并且我主神应许你，必为你建立家室。
and that the Lord will make you a house.
好，第12节说：“你寿数满足，与你列祖同睡的时候，我必使你的后裔接续你的位，我也必坚定他的国。”
In verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom.
我们看到的就是神跟大卫说
We have to see that God told David,
我选召你来做以色列人的君，
I have called you to be the ruler over Israel,
我要跟你同在，
and I will be with you,
然后我要让你能够得到平安。
and I will cause you to have rest.
你要为我建立殿宇这个事情，谢谢了。
And the intention of you wanting to build me a temple, thank you.
但是我要应许你，要为你建设你的家。
But I promise you that I will make you a house.
那这个家，其实在神所讲的这一段话里面，有包括他大卫自己的家庭。
And this house that God said in this conversation includes David's own household,
也包括他接下来子孙所要继承的王位，
and also includes the descendants that are to inherit this throne.
也包括整个以色列百姓的这个国度。
And also it includes the whole kingdom of Israel.
所以神是反过来要建立大卫的整个家。
And so, contrary, God actually wanted to make David a house.
本来大卫是想要为神做什么事，
Originally, David wanted to do something for God.
但是神反过来要为他建立整个家，是他万万没有想到这么大的福气。
But God actually wanted to bless David and make him a house.
那神给大卫的福气，你看他特别提到说，你的子孙要接续你做王，直到永远。
And the blessing that God gave to David was that his descendants will come after him and inherit the throne forever.
第14节说，我要做他的父，他做我的子。
Verse 14, I will be his father and he shall be my son.
也就是说，神要成为在大卫家里面真正的主人。
Which is to say that God will become the true master in the household of David.
他如果犯罪，我就要用杖打他。
If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men.
那虽然我责打他，但是我的慈爱不会离开他。
But even though I discipline him, my mercy shall not depart from him.
16节说：“你的家跟你的国必在我面前永远坚立。”
Verse 16 says, Your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before me.
这就是神当时候给大卫的应许。
At that time, it was the promise that God gave to David.
这件事情也应验了在历史上。
And this promise was realized in history.
也应验在属灵的基督国度的建立。
And it's also fulfilled in the spiritual kingdom of Jesus Christ.
你说当时候拿单呢，他把这些话都讲给大卫听了以后，
So at that time, after Prophet Nathan spoke all these words to David,
大卫他接下去第18节说，他俊气坐在神的面前。
in verse 18, King David went in and sat before the Lord.
应该是他到了神的约柜那里去。
He should have went in front of the ark of God.
他俯伏在神面前。
He prostrated himself in front of God.
18节这一段就是大卫的祷告跟他的感谢。
And starting from verse 18, this was David's thanksgiving and his prayer.
大卫跟神说：“主啊，我是谁？我的家算什么？你竟使我到这个地步。”
David said to God, Who am I, O Lord God? What is my house that you have brought me this far?
我们就看到大卫他领受神的应许之后，他更加谦卑。
We could see that after David received the promise of God, he became even more humble.
他非常的感谢神的恩典。
He was truly thankful for the grace of God.
第19节说：“主啊，这岂是人所常遇见的呢？你会照顾我的家到永远，这是何等的福气！”
In verse 19, David said, You have also spoken of your servant's house for a great while to come. What is this the manner of man? Such great blessing.
也就是说，你看大卫他很知道说，神所给他的祝福远超过他所祈求的。
So David understood that the blessing that God gave him was more than what he had asked.
然后我们接下去看第22节。大卫他赞美神的伟大。
Let's continue to read verse 22. David praised the greatness of God.
除你以外没有别神。
There is none like you.
他纪念，他想起了神他的作为。
David remembered the works God did.
第23节，世上有何民能比你的民以色列呢？
Verse 23, Who is like your people, like Israel?
你在他们面前行大而可畏的事情。
You did for yourselves great and awesome deeds.
你做了他们的神。
You were their God.
所以成为神的子民是何等有福。
And so how blessed is it to become the people of God?
他知道神他的计划。
Because David understood God's plan.
他看到了神的作为以后，他非常的感谢。
And after he saw God's work, he was filled with thanksgiving.
他看到这位神是永不改变的。
He saw that this God never changes.
所以过去神所做的事情，今天大卫他也经历了。
And so the things that God did in the past, David experienced in his own time.
所以他现在对神生出更大的信心。
And so he grew a stronger faith in the Lord.
25节，主啊，你所应许仆人和仆人家的话，求你坚定，直到永远。
In verse 25, Now, O Lord God, the word which you have spoken concerning your servant and concerning his house, establish it forever.
照你所说的而行。
Do as you have said.
表示大卫他真的相信这位神会实现他所应许的。
This shows us that David truly believed that God would do it according to what he had said.
他第26节说：“愿人永远尊你的名为大。”
In verse 26, David said, Let your name be magnified forever.
他在神面前的卑微是相信自己只是一个被受高的管理的人，真正治理神的家是这位神。
David's humility was shown before God by showing that he was only a entrusted person to rule over this kingdom. God was the real ruler of his people.
所以大卫你看他看到的是神的名将是大大的被荣耀。
And so what David saw was that the name of God will be magnified.
所以 我们就看到历史上真的证明了神的应许是真的。
And so from history, we were able to see that God's promise was fulfilled.
大卫他的蒙福其实很简单，
The blessing that David received was actually quite simple.
就从他跟神建立了亲密关系以后，
It was after he had established a close relationship with
他
God.
现在做什么事情都先想到神。
After he did that, everything he did was concerning God.
然后他想要为神的家做一些事情，
And then he wanted to do something for the house of God.
虽然他不适合做，后来他知道他的请求被拒绝了，
Even though he was not the person to do it, and he found out that his
但
request
是他
was
并没有生
denied,
气啊，
but he did not become
他
angry.
反而更大的感谢神，
But he actually praised and thanked God even more.
更加的谦卑自己。
And he humbled himself even more.
那什么事情求问神，
And he would ask God for everything.
那真的神就让他不管往哪里去都得胜了。
And so God truly gave him victories wherever he
那
went.
大卫他也知道说，他要把他所得的要来奉献给神了。
And David also understood that whatever it was that he received, he needed to offer them to God.
如果从经文的这个安排来看，第8章就记载了大卫，你看他到处得胜之后，把他所获得的战利品，就把它分别出来奉献给神。
From the chronological records of the Bible in chapter 8, after David had all these victories, he offered the things that he got to God.
所以第11节就特别8章的第11节就是说，他将这些器皿，他制服各国所得来的金银，都分别为圣，来献给神。
In verse 11, it says that King David also dedicated these to the Lord, along with the silver and the gold that he had dedicated from all the nations which he had subdued.
这就是大卫他对神的感谢。
Now, all these things were the thanksgiving that David had
他
for
爱
God.
神之后，神给他大大的应许，
After he showed his love for God, God gave him a great
让他
promise.
得胜，
He was able to be
让他的
victorious,
家蒙福，
and his house was blessed.
他就将神所给他的再来奉献给神。
And then he offered back to God whatever it was that he received.
所以一切都从他关心神的家开始而已。
And this all began because he cared for the household of God.
今天我们在我们的信仰生活里面呢，
In our spiritual life
如果我
today,
们能够效法大卫，
if we're able to follow David's
都
example,
想到神的事情，
and if we remember the things pertaining to
今
God,
天我们对我们的家是怎么样的用心？
how do we put in effort in our own
如果我们也
families?
会用这样的心来关心神的家，
And if we use the same kind of heart to care for the household of God,
但是这个时候我们又要注意一点，
and at the same time we also pay
大
attention
卫曾经犯过错误，
that David once made mistakes,
因为他的方式一开始的时候并不是照神的吩咐来的，
because his ways did not first come from the instructions of God.
后来等到他查明白之后，
And then after he carefully searched
他
out,
现在爱神的方式就按照神的命令了，
he followed the commandments of God.
所以他所做的就蒙神的纪念，
And then so whatever he did was remembered by God.
神还赐给他超过他所求的。
And God even gave him more than what he had asked.
那这个就是我们今天所敬拜的神。
And this is the God that we worship
我
today.
们今天要得到福气，其实方法很简单的。
It is very simple for us to receive blessings
所以有
today.
时候我们要在生活当中去反省我们的信仰生活。
So sometimes in our lives we need to examine our spiritual
我们
life.
会不会觉得我们的福气好像减少了？
Do we feel that our blessings have diminished?
如果我们觉得好像最近这个生活上处处都好像很不顺利，
If we feel that we are not in a smooth sailing life,
我们现在所领受的跟过去我们几年前所经历的，是不是觉得自己恩典变少了？
and do we feel that the blessings that we have received were less than what we had before?
那我们就去想想看，我们爱神的心是越多呢，还是减少？
Then we can think about the heart of loving God. Did it increase or did it decrease?
通常我们所听到的见证都是，当我们爱神更多的时候，我们的恩典就更多了。
The testimonies that we hear are often that the more that we love God, then the more blessings we receive.
当我们会回头来反省我们跟神的关系的时候，
And when we look back and examine our own relationship with
我们
God,
会去多关心神的家的一些 活动。
then we will pay more attention and care for the activities in the household of
我们会
God.
尊重神的圣洁，
And we will respect God's holiness.
在意神所讲的每一个话。
And we will pay attention to the words God had
我们
spoken.
真的采取行动去做了，
And then we really follow up with our
我们
actions.
就会真的会再一次的体验神给大卫的这些福气。
And then we will once again experience the blessings that God gave to David.
神的恩典会让我们更加谦卑，
And the grace and blessings of God will make us even more
我
humble.
们会想到的是神的名的缘故了。
We will think about the name of God.
所以我们去爱神的时候，我们绝对不会失望。
So when we start to love God, we will not be disappointed.
我们每一个，我们不管是我们自己，包括我们的全家，都要因此蒙福。
And not only ourselves, but also our whole family will be blessed because of this.
愿主耶稣基督能够帮助我们，
May the Lord Jesus Christ help us.
因为教会许多的圣工都需要我们弟兄姐妹一起来参与。
Because there are many different holy work in the church that require participation from all the brothers and sisters.
那我们从大卫来学习这些道理，
So let us learn from David all these
我们
words,
愿意爱主更多，
so that we make a determination to love the Lord
我们
more,
的恩典必不减少。
and that our blessings will surely increase.
一起来唱诗
Let's sing a hymn,
99首。
99.